In the summer of 1944, the United States owned most of the world's money. That isn't a figure of speech. Depending on the year you pick and who is doing the counting, somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of all the monetary gold on Earth was sitting in American vaults. Europe was rubble. Britain was insolvent and knew it. So when 730 delegates from 44 nations arrived at a hotel in the White Mountains of New Hampshire that July, they had not come to negotiate the terms. They had come to be told what the terms were. 27 years later, the arithmetic had turned upside down. By the summer of 1971, American monetary gold was worth roughly $10 billion. Foreign governments held claims against it worth about $40 billion, $4 of promise for every dollar of metal. In the first week of that August, the Treasury lost $850 million of gold. We know the number because Nixon's chief of staff read it out to him in the Oval Office, and the tape kept running. The Germans and the Dutch were reportedly lining up for 200 million more. There was no attack, no fleet, no embargo, no enemy. The thing dismantling the most powerful currency on the planet was a subtraction problem a bank clerk could do on the back of a deposit slip. It had been done in public, out loud, in front of Congress, 11 years earlier. So what does a country do when it can no longer honor the promise its entire alliance is built on? At 9 o'clock on the evening of Sunday, the 15th of August, 1971, Richard Nixon sat down in front of a television camera and read out a sentence drafted 3 days earlier in a cabin in Maryland. The load-bearing part of that sentence is a single word, 9 letters. The word is temporarily. It has now been temporary for 55 years. The version most of us were taught is 4 seconds long. Nixon took America off gold. Inflation followed. Exchange rates started floating. All of that is true, and almost none of it is the part worth knowing. 4 things get left out. The Trap That Killed the System was published in English in 1960 by an economist who told a congressional committee precisely how and why it would end, and was ignored for a decade. The man everyone blames for draining the gold was not the largest claimant, and the actual numbers say so. The officials in that cabin thought they were buying 18 months, and spent the next 18 months trying to put the thing back together. And what replaced gold was not chaos. It was a new disciplinarian, one that took 9 more years and the worst recession since the 1930s to install. That last part is the story. This is where the world you actually live in came from. Start with the mechanics, because most people have them slightly wrong. The Bretton Woods Conference ran from the 1st to the 22nd of July, 1944. The hotel had been shut for 2 years and was reopened specially. It was, by every account, overcrowded. 2 plans were on the table. John Maynard Keynes, representing a bankrupt Britain, wanted an international clearing union issuing its own reserve asset, which he proposed to call Bancor. The point of Bancor was that it would penalize surplus countries as well as deficit ones, spreading the pain of adjustment. Harry Dexter White, of the U.S. Treasury, wanted something simpler and more American. White won, which is what happens when your country holds the gold. As a footnote, White was later identified in decrypted Soviet cables as a source for Soviet intelligence, a detail that has nothing to do with the monetary economics and is impossible to leave out once you know it. The system that emerged had 2 layers. The dollar was fixed to gold at $35 an ounce. Every other major currency was fixed to the dollar, inside a narrow band, and could only be moved by agreement. The International Monetary Fund would lend to countries that ran short. 2 words worth defining, because the whole story turns on them. Convertibility meant that a foreign central bank holding dollars could walk up to the U.S. Treasury and swap them for metal at $35 an ounce, guaranteed. That was the promise. Reserve currency meant everybody else stockpiled dollars instead of gold, because dollars paid interest and gold sat in a vault doing nothing. Dollars were better than gold, so long as the promise held. Notice the asymmetry. Only one country had to keep a vault. Everyone else kept dollars. That promise was extended exclusively to foreign governments and central banks. Ordinary Americans had been legally barred from owning monetary gold since 1933, a detail we will come back to, because it turns out to matter enormously. For the first decade, the problem was the opposite of what you would expect. There weren't enough dollars. Europe couldn't buy American goods because it had nothing to pay with, and no amount of demand could conjure the means to pay. Economists called it the dollar shortage. The Marshall Plan, $13 billion pushed across the Atlantic between 1948 and 1952 existed partly to fix it, and the fix worked. Germany and Japan rebuilt. Their factories got newer than America's because they had been flattened and had to start again. Then it flipped. By the late 1950s, the shortage had become a surplus, and every year America spent more abroad than it earned there, on imports, on foreign investment, on several hundred military bases. Each of those dollars was a small IOU for gold, held by somebody who had not yet decided whether to cash it. In October 1959, a Belgian-born economist at Yale named Robert Triffin sat down in front of the Joint Economic Committee of Congress and explained, in 17 printed pages, how the system was going to die. The following year, he expanded it into a book, Gold and the Dollar Crisis. Published by Yale, the argument is now taught as the Triffin dilemma, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. World trade grows. Growing trade needs growing reserves. The world's reserves are dollars. The only way the rest of the world can accumulate dollars is if America sends out more dollars than it takes in, which means running permanent deficits. Fine so far. But every dollar that leaves America is a fresh claim on the same fixed pile of gold. So the longer the system works as designed, the worse the ratio gets. Success is the disease. If America ever stops running deficits, world trade strangles for lack of reserves. If it keeps running them, the promise underneath the whole arrangement becomes visibly unpayable. There is no third option. That is what makes it a dilemma rather than a mistake. The remarkable thing is what happened next, which is nothing. Triffin was not a crank shouting from the margins. He had helped design the European Payments Union. He held a chair at Yale, and he was testifying to Congress on the record. His book was reviewed in the IMF's own staff journal. Everybody with responsibility for the system read the argument, conceded it was probably right, and carried on, because the alternatives all required somebody to accept a loss today to avoid a larger one later. Governments are not good at that trade, and it happened exactly on schedule. In 1959, American gold still comfortably covered foreign official dollar claims. By 1964, it didn't. By 1971, it covered about a quarter of them. On the 4th of February, 1965, Charles de Gaulle held a press conference and said the quiet part in public. The willingness of other states to treat dollars as equivalent to gold, he said, had allowed the United States to be indebted to the rest of the world free of charge, paying its debts in a currency it could issue at will. The phrase attached to that idea, America's exorbitant privilege, is almost always credited to de Gaulle. He didn't say it. It was his finance minister, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, and it reached the wider public through a newspaper column by Raymond Aron. A handful of historians trace it further back, to de Gaulle's advisor Jacques Rueff. De Gaulle got the credit because he had the better voice. France began converting dollars into metal in earnest, and the defensive machinery started failing. In November 1961, 8 central banks, Britain, West Germany, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, France, and the United States, formed the London Gold Pool, quietly selling gold into the London market whenever the price threatened to rise above $35. It was a cartel, and its product was the appearance of stability. It worked for 6 years. France withdrew in 1967. Sterling was devalued by 14.3% on the 18th of November that year, which told every speculator on earth that fixed parities were negotiable after all. On the 17th of March 1968, the gold pool collapsed. The survivors split the market in two, one official price for governments, one free price for everybody else. From that moment, the $35 peg was a fiction, maintained by mutual agreement among people who all knew it was a fiction. Now, the popular story says France did this. France drained America's vaults. It's a good story, and the numbers do not support it. The U.S. Minerals Yearbook for 1971 lists the foreign short-term claims potentially payable in gold at the end of that year, by country, and the order is not what you would guess. Japan, $14.3 billion. The United Kingdom, $7.4. West Germany, $6.6. Canada, $3.4. Switzerland, $3.2. France, $3.1. France was 6th. America's problem was not one angry general in Paris. It was that everybody, including its closest allies, had quietly worked out that the promise could not be kept, and nobody wanted to be last in the queue. To understand why that number was so brittle, go back another 11 years, to a story most people have never heard. The gold standard Nixon supposedly ended in 1971 was not ancient, it was 37 years old, and it was invented in a hurry. Britain had abandoned gold in September 1931. In April 1933, 6 weeks into his presidency, Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102. It required American citizens to hand in their gold coin, bullion, and gold certificates to the Federal Reserve by the 1st of May. The compensation was the then official price of $20.67 an ounce. Holdings under $100 were exempt, as were collectors' coins and gold used in industry and the arts. Picture the actual scene, because it's easily forgotten. Ordinary people queuing at bank counters with coins in envelopes and cigar boxes and paper bags, handing over the family's savings in exchange for paper, because the government had told them to. Compliance was high, prosecutions were rare and mostly symbolic. Then, through the winter of 1933, Roosevelt set about pushing the dollar price of gold upward day by day, on the theory that a cheaper dollar would lift collapsing farm and commodity prices. He did this from his bedroom, over breakfast, with his Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau and a couple of advisors in attendance. Morgenthau wrote down what happened one morning. The president proposed raising the price by 21 cents. Asked why 21, he said it was a lucky number, because it was 3 times 7. Morgenthau recorded that if anybody knew how they really set the price of gold, they would be terrified. On the 30th of January 1934, the Gold Reserve Act fixed it at $35 an ounce. That figure, the number the entire post-war world would be pegged to, the number Bretton Woods was built on, the number that would eventually break, was a political choice made during the Depression by a president who was, at least once, guessing. So when people say 1971 destroyed a timeless monetary anchor, hold the thought. The anchor was cast in 1934 at a price nobody could defend on first principles, and it was never redeemable by an American citizen at any point in its existence. The gold window was always a foreign window. It was a promise made to other governments, and in 1971 it was broken by a president talking to his own voters, most of whom had never been allowed near the thing being discussed. On Friday the 13th of August 1971, Nixon flew to Camp David and told nobody where he was going or why. The State Department's own published record of the meeting, in the Foreign Relations of the United States series, lists who was in the room from the President's daily diary: Treasury Secretary John Connally, Fed Chairman Arthur Burns, Undersecretary for Monetary Affairs Paul Volcker, Budget Director George Shultz, Economic Advisors Paul McCracken, Herbert Stein, and Peter Peterson, Chief of Staff Bob Haldeman and John Ehrlichman, and the speechwriter William Safire, which tells you what the president thought the weekend was mainly about. The first session ran from 3:15 until 7 in the evening. Nixon made every participant sign the guest book. It was that kind of weekend, a man who understood he was doing something historic and wanted a list. By Sunday, they had a package. Suspend gold convertibility, freeze all wages and prices for 90 days by executive order, under authority Congress had handed the president the previous year and never expected him to use. Slap a 10% surcharge on imports. That last item was not an afterthought. It was the lever. Connally's plan was to hold the surcharge over Europe and Japan until they agreed to revalue their currencies upward, making American exports cheaper. The gold decision and the trade decision were one decision, and the trade half is the half that got forgotten. Consider the sequence for a moment. 15 men spent a weekend in the Maryland woods rewriting the monetary constitution of the non-communist world. No allies were consulted. No legislature voted. The IMF, the institution created in 1944 to manage exactly this situation, found out from the television. The gold arithmetic explains the timing. It does not, on its own, explain the package. Nixon was 14 months from an election he had already lost once, in 1960, by a margin thin enough to haunt him. Unemployment in 1971 was running near 6%. Consumer prices were rising at a bit over 4%, which sounds mild now, and did not sound mild then. He had watched his own party lose the White House in 1960, with the economy soft, and he was not going to repeat the experiment. The wage and price freeze was the popular part. Genuinely popular. It polled extremely well, because voters experience inflation as something being done to them by someone. The gold suspension was the technical part, buried in the middle of a speech that spent far more time on jobs and taxes. Read the speech, and you can see the packaging. Nixon told the country that The speculators have been waging an all-out war on the American dollar, and that the gainers are the international money speculators, who thrive on crises and therefore help to create them. That framing was political cover, and it is worth being blunt about it. The people redeeming dollars for American gold in the summer of 1971 were not shadowy currency traders. They were the central banks of Japan, Britain, West Germany, Canada, Switzerland, and France, allied governments acting entirely within a right the United States had granted them in writing at Bretton Woods. Nixon needed a villain who wasn't NATO. He invented one at the podium. He also offered a reassurance that has aged into one of the more useful sentences in economic history. "Let me lay to rest the bugaboo of what is called devaluation," he said. "Your dollar," he told viewers, "would be worth just as much tomorrow as it was today." 2 people in that cabin thought closing the window was a mistake, and both of them lost. Arthur Burns, the Fed chairman, had spent weeks lobbying against it. He believed the suspension would destroy American credibility abroad and solve nothing at home, and he was pushing instead for the wage and price controls, which he did support. Paul Volcker was the other, and he is the one to watch. In August 1971, almost nobody outside the Treasury building knew his name. He was 43, he was 6 feet 7 inches tall, chain-smoked cheap cigars, and had spent his career moving between the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, Chase Manhattan, and the Treasury, always one rung below the people whose names got printed. Since 1969, he had been Undersecretary for Monetary Affairs, which meant that the contingency plans for a gold suspension had been sitting in his drawer, in his own drafting, for 2 years. So Volcker was not surprised by the decision. He was surprised by the shape of it. His position was that if you were going to break the promise, you broke it on a Sunday, and you were back at the table on Monday with a concrete plan to build something else. Suspension had to be the opening move of a negotiation, not the whole move. Announce it alone, with no successor system attached, and you would discover that there is no such thing as a temporary suspension of a promise. Nobody rebuilds a door they have proven they can live without. He said this. He was heard politely. Then the package went out as written. Both men were overruled by John Connally, a Texas politician with no background in monetary economics and total command of the room, and by a president who had decided that the domestic audience was the only audience that counted. Keep Volcker in mind. In 8 years, the United States will come looking for him, and he will be asked to supply, personally, the thing that was thrown away that weekend. Here is the part I find hard to shake. On the 12th of August, 3 days before the broadcast, Arthur Burns opened his private journal and wrote that his efforts to prevent the closing of the gold window, working through Connally, Volcker, and Schultz, did not seem to have succeeded. The window might have to be closed tomorrow, he wrote, because the government seemed incapable of any action at all. Then he added 5 words. What a tragedy for mankind. That is the chairman of the Federal Reserve, in his own handwriting, in private, 72 hours before the fact. Here is the thing the textbook version gets most wrong. August 1971 was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a serious, sustained, well-resourced attempt to rebuild the system, an attempt that failed so completely it has been more or less deleted from popular memory. The morning after the broadcast, European exchanges simply closed rather than open into the chaos. Tokyo stayed open. The Bank of Japan, legally obliged to defend a yen pegged at 360 to the dollar since 1949, bought dollars by the billion for the better part of a fortnight before giving up at the end of the month. In Japan, the event is still called the Nixon shock, and the name has never lost its sting. Then came the negotiation. At a Group of 10 meeting in Rome at the end of November, European finance ministers pressed Connally on what the United States intended to do about its own currency. His answer became the most quoted line of the entire episode. The dollar is our currency, but it's your problem. Behind the bluster, the Americans were negotiating hard. Nixon met the French president, Georges Pompidou, in the Azores in mid-December and settled the outline of a realignment directly, head of state to head of state, before the finance ministers were allowed to ratify it. Volcker did the technical work, flying between capitals, trying to assemble a set of exchange rates that every country would accept and defend. On the 17th and 18th of December 1971, the same ministers met at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington and signed a deal. Gold was repriced from $35 to $38. The yen went from 360 to 308. The bands within which currencies could move were widened from 1% to 2.25%. Crucially, the dollar was still not convertible into gold. The new price was a bookkeeping entry. Standing in front of the assembled ministers, Nixon called it the most significant monetary agreement in the history of the world. It lasted 14 months. By February 1973, the United States devalued again, to $42.22. By March, the major currencies were floating, and the system designed in New Hampshire in 1944 was finished for good. Volcker spent that entire period flying between capitals, trying to construct a replacement. There wasn't one. And then the second-order effects arrived, in a form nobody at Camp David had modeled. Oil was priced in dollars. When the dollar fell, the real income of every oil exporter fell with it, without a single barrel changing hands. OPEC members said so explicitly and repeatedly through 1972 and 1973. Whether that grievance caused what came next is genuinely disputed among historians. The October 1973 embargo was triggered by the Yom Kippur War, and the cartel had been building pricing power for years regardless. What is not disputed is that the dollar's devaluation was one of the stated reasons, and that it made an oil shock cheaper to justify and more attractive to attempt. So look at what everybody actually got. Europe got exchange rate volatility it had spent 30 years trying to avoid, and began, almost immediately, building the machinery that would eventually become the euro. Japan got a permanently stronger yen and an export model that had to be rebuilt around it. The United States got the freedom to run its own monetary policy without a vault to answer to, and the world got the 1970s. American consumer price inflation ran at 6.2% in 1973, 11% in 1974. It came down, then came back, and peaked at 14.8% in March 1980. Numbers that size stop being economics and start being sociology. Savings evaporate quietly. Wage negotiations turn adversarial because both sides are guessing. Pensioners on fixed incomes discover that a lifetime of prudence was a bet on a promise the government had stopped keeping. Gold, freed from its $35 cage, hit $850 an ounce on the 21st of January 1980. There is an uncomfortable footnote here, and it belongs to Arthur Burns. The man who wrote What a Tragedy for Mankind in his journal ran the Federal Reserve until 1978, which means the central bank that accommodated the first and worst stretch of the Great Inflation was chaired, throughout, by the official who had most clearly seen what was coming. Burns understood the theory perfectly. He was also under sustained personal pressure from a president who wanted easy money through the 1972 election, and the tapes and his own diaries record how that pressure was applied. Economists have been arguing about how much weight to put on the politics ever since. Burton Abrams published a detailed reconstruction of the Nixon pressure campaign in 2006. Others put more of the blame on the economic models of the day, which badly underestimated how fast inflation expectations could become self-fulfilling. Either way, the lesson is the same one, and it is the lesson that eventually justified everything Volcker did. A constraint you can talk your way around is not a constraint. Gold never took a phone call from the White House. In July 1979, Jimmy Carter phoned his Treasury Undersecretary Anthony Solomon, who was in his backyard swimming pool, and asked for a name to run the Federal Reserve. Solomon said, "Paul Volcker." Carter's reply, according to Solomon, was, "Who's that?" Volcker took the job in August 1979 and did the only thing left to do. He raised the federal funds rate towards 20%. The prime rate hit 21.5% in December 1980. The average 30-year mortgage went above 18% in October 1981. Unemployment climbed to 10.8% in November and December 1982, the highest since the Depression. Mexico defaulted in August 1982, and the Latin American debt crisis began. People fought back with the only materials they had. Home builders, sitting on lumber nobody was buying, stuck postage stamps directly onto 2x4s and mailed them to the Federal Reserve. Car dealers with full lots posted him their keys. Farmers facing foreclosure drove tractors to Washington and ringed the Fed's headquarters. The trade magazine Tennessee Professional Builder ran a wanted poster of Volcker and his colleagues on its cover, accusing them of the premeditated murder of small business. One of those 2x4s never left. A young staff economist named David Wilcox was given one by a colleague and kept it on his desk. Wilcox went on to direct the Fed's Division of Research and Statistics. For years, the institution's most senior forecaster worked next to a piece of scrap lumber that an unemployed carpenter had paid postage on to tell his government it had ruined him. Another is in the Museum of American Finance in New York, where you can go and look at it. The inflation broke. By 1983, it was under 4%, and it has never returned to those levels since. The reversal is the whole story in 2 sentences. In 1944, the dollar was disciplined by a vault in Kentucky. By 1982, it was disciplined by a man who could not be voted out of office. First, the Triffin dilemma itself is contested. The economists Michael Bordo and Robert Macaulay have argued directly that Triffin overstated the instability and that the system's collapse owed more to specific American policy choices, particularly deficit spending on Vietnam and the Great Society without matching taxes, than to an unavoidable structural trap. Their paper is called Triffin, Dilemma or Myth, and it is a serious challenge to the version I've just spent 10 minutes explaining. I find Triffin persuasive. I don't think it's settled. Second, the trigger. You will often read that the weekend was set in motion by a British request to convert $3 billion into gold. Some accounts, including Jeffrey Garton's detailed history of the weekend, report it as a request for cover, an exchange rate guarantee, which American officials misread as a demand for metal, and a British file in the National Archives records a flat denial that the Bank of England ever asked for conversion, or that the $3 billion figure had any basis at all. I don't know which is right, neither does anyone else, quite. Third, and most important, there is a popular set of charts online under the heading What Happened in 1971, which lays wage stagnation, inequality, housing costs, and much else at the door of that Sunday broadcast. Some of it is fair, most of it is a correlation dressed as a mechanism. The early 1970s contained the oil shocks, the collapse of the post-war productivity boom, the entry of hundreds of millions of workers into global labor markets, and enormous shifts in tax and union policy. Blaming a single monetary decision for all of it is the kind of tidy answer that should make you suspicious. What I'll defend is narrower, and I think it holds. August 1971 is when the world's money stopped being anchored to a physical quantity and started being anchored to institutional promises. That is a real hinge. It is just not a master key. Which brings us to the thing that actually replaced gold, and why the answer is not nothing. Under Bretton Woods, a government that overspent eventually faced a queue at the gold window. The constraint was physical, stupid, and completely indifferent to politics. That is what made it work, and it is also what made it intolerable, because a constraint that cannot bend also cannot absorb a shock. What took its place took roughly 2 decades to build, and it has 2 parts. The first is the bond market. If a government borrows more than its creditors think it can service, they demand a higher yield, and the cost lands on that government's own budget, usually within the electoral cycle. The second is central bank independence, with an explicit inflation target. New Zealand went first, restructuring its central bank in 1989 and adopting a formal target in 1990. 30-odd countries followed. The Federal Reserve only wrote its 2% target down in January 2012, 4 decades after the vault closed. So the discipline didn't vanish. It changed form, from a promise about a medal into a promise about behavior enforced by whoever happens to be holding the debt. Gold could not be argued with. A central bank can. That is simultaneously the great advantage of the system we have and the permanent source of anxiety about it. And it scaled beyond anything the men in that cabin imagined. In April 2025, the Bank for International Settlements measured global foreign exchange turnover at $9.6 trillion per day, with the US dollar on one side of 89% of all trades. The currency that could not honor $10 billion of gold claims in 1971 now sits at the center of a market that turns over the entire 1971 American economy roughly every 8 hours. Gold, which the United States government valued at $35 an ounce for 37 years, trades today above $4,000. Every floating exchange rate, every emerging market currency crisis, every argument about whether a central bank should be independent, every mortgage rate that moves because 9 unelected people published a statement, and every headline about de-dollarization traces back through a chain of decisions to a Sunday evening broadcast in which a president used the word temporarily and meant it. and to a hotel in New Hampshire where the delegates of 44 nations agreed that the value of money could be settled by treaty and kept in a vault. It couldn't. That was the discovery. Everything since has been the world building something to put in its place. If you got this far, drop the year 1934 in the comments. Most people don't realize that's where the $35 came from, and I'd like to know who stayed. Subscribe if you want more of these. It genuinely helps, and there's a longer piece coming on how the euro was designed to solve exactly the problem Nixon created.